Discover over 100 episodes of Bartholomew Town on Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
In terms of my professional life, that's the big thing. Tell a story, be creative, do something different. I've never been afraid to try different formats. I've not been afraid to fail. I don't like to fail, who does? But I've not been afraid to, and I've learned from failure.
Welcome in to another edition of the Bartholomew Town Podcast. I'm your host, Bill Bartholomew. On today's episode, my conversation with multimedia journalist G. Wayne Miller. And Wayne Miller, someone who's made his mark as a writer, photographer, new media journalist here in Rhode Island through the Providence Journal and nationally through his widely syndicated television program, Story in the Public Square, which originates right down the street from me, actually, at the studios of Rhode Island Public Television. So a fascinating conversation with an agile storyteller based in Rhode Island. Support for Bartholomew Town comes from PDQ Graphics of Newport, a full-service commercial printing company and graphic design studio, serving Aquidneck Island and the surrounding area for over 40 years, specializing in creative graphic design, offset and digital printing, as well as large format signage. Discover more at pdqri.com or give them a call at 401-849-3820. And hope you had a spectacular 4th of July. Primetime, getting into it right here in Rhode Island. All right, let's get right to it now with the one and only G. Wayne Miller. One of the leading multimedia artists in the market, certainly familiar to multiple audiences, which I think is something that's kind of specific around here. A lot of people are narrow-casted. They have their sports audience. They have their opinion audience on the left or the right. You're a very mass-appealing journalist. Is that how you set out to do your work?
Well, thank you for the compliment. And no, I actually began my professional career as a journalist, a print journalist. Yep. And that was preceded by a long-time love of writing. Going back to, I wish I still had it, but I have a memory of a short story I wrote on my own in 3rd grade. Yeah. And so writing has really always captivated me. So I went to college and I took some creative writing courses there. Never actually took a course in journalism. Graduated from college, worked at Delta Airlines in Boston.
Interesting.
Actually supporting a freelance writing career. My mother would often say, I sent you to Harvard so you could load bags on airplanes. But she actually understood the writing bug that I had. So I applied endlessly to newspapers because I figured there's a way I can both write and earn a living and not break my knees and backs, for an entire career loading bags onto Delta Airlines jets. And I was rejected everywhere, pretty much. And then one editor, Rod Doherty from the North Adams Transcript, no longer there as part of the Berkshire Eagle, took a shot on me. He had no reason to hire me, really, but he called me in for an interview, and things went well, and so I started there. And that's really where my writing career began. So I spent a lot of time in print journalism, went to the Cape Cod Times after the North Adams Transcript, and then came to the Providence Journal in 1981. And that was a time when we had a very large staff. There was a lot of quote unquote, creative writing that was encouraged. It was nonfiction writing, of course, but that was encouraged by a number of editors, including Joel Rawson, who retired a number of years ago, and several other people there who proved mentors. So that gave me an opportunity to sort of expand my writing reach, as it were, into features, into long-term narratives. And at some point along there, I began to incorporate other forms of storytelling into my journalism. And that would be, obviously, still photography, video at a somewhat later date. And, sort of one thing led to another. And today at the Journal, we do storytelling in all of those formats. We also do podcasting, which I like. So, really, to sort of answer the question, or maybe you didn't even ask this question, the appeal has been storytelling.
Sure.
In whatever way I could. It started, as I mentioned, with writing, but, as technology changed, as the internet happened and so forth and so on. Also, throughout this whole time, I had a real passionate interest in still photography. going back to earliest childhood when I got a camera as a gift from a beloved aunt. So I had liked that from the beginning too. So again, storytelling in whatever means, video. We've done some films, and of course we have Story in the Public Square, which is a partnership of the Pell Center and the Providence Journal, and it's a weekly national show. And we can talk about that if you'd like.
Absolutely, yeah. No, storytelling, that's before we began recording. We were kind of talking about my backstory and music and everything. I'm a songwriter.
Yeah.
That's the connection between podcasting and songwriting for me. I don't feel like it's that much of a different outlet. I wonder if you feel that way when, obviously, there's nuances, but the stream of consciousness, whether you're taking or working on a photo, working on a piece in a written format, audio, video, there's kind of a unification there that is you and how you tell a story.
Yeah, that's a very astute comment. It's the creative spirit, really. I don't know enough about the brain to say what part of the brain that comes from.
Yep.
But there clearly is, there's an inspiration and impetus to create, and to create in different ways. Some people create in certain, perhaps limited ways, or they prefer a certain way, which is all well and good. I have, as I was saying earlier, been attracted to different ways of letting that creative expression. I wish I could draw. I mean, I would probably draw, but I can't. I'm just a horrible, horrible drawer. But these other formats and ways to tell stories and express creativity have just, always appealed to me.
Yep.
It's what gets me up early in the morning every day. I happen to have a very early work ethic. I get a lot of my work done early. So, yeah, that's what keeps me going. I mean, there are other things, too, in terms of my personal life. But in terms of my professional life, that's the big thing. Tell a story, be creative, do something different. I've never been afraid to try different formats. I've not been afraid to fail. I don't like to fail. Who does? But I've not been afraid to, and I've learned from failure. And, sort of self-taught in a lot of these media, but also learned from a lot of the masters as well. Podcasting is a new thing for me, but I like it. I do a number of them for the Providence Journal. Yes. And that's it's a good part of our audience, is podcasting and audio. So
yeah, podcasting is a combination of, in a lot of ways, different mediums that we're already familiar with. It's just that theater of the mind aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, it harkens to the age of radio, with radio theater. One of our very early guests on Story in the Public Square was Mark Smerling, who is one of the great podcasters of our time. He did Crime Town, which was a huge hit here in Rhode Island. He has since done a similar version out of Detroit. He also has a background in TV and in film. So that really brought to my attention in a more significant way podcasting. Just having him on the show, getting to know him. I worked with him behind the scenes on Crime Town. It really opened my eyes to podcasting. I mean, I knew it was out there. I knew the practical advantages of it. You can listen to it when you're driving, when you're working out, when you're lying in your bed or on your sofa or whatever. And I think particularly among younger people, it's just a huge audience and storytelling means. I have 3 children, one of whom is in his 20s, 2 in their 30s, and they're big podcast fans. And they like crime, too, which I guess they grew up in Rhode Island, so I guess that makes sense.
They go hand in hand, yeah.
Yeah, they do go hand in hand, yeah.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. The Journal's podcast, well, when you think about it, a lot of times the Ed Acorn podcast, it doesn't have the consistency that other national podcasts have. Is that something that you have any role in trying to make it more of a regular, all of the podcasts, getting the Journal to kind of become a podcast network, I guess? It seems so possible. Is that something you're working towards where there's a...
It's not something I'm working toward. The podcasts I do generally are taken from the audio tracks from Story in the Public Square.
Right.
And the way that works, we do our recording at Rhode Island PBS, where, our flagship studio. And then we get an audio version, and of course we get the video version. My co-host and I, Jim Ludis, work on the editing with the folks at Rhode Island PBS. But we get that MP3 soundtrack, which I then turn into a podcast for the Journal. So in terms of production, it's not really anything I do much of. It's really just transferring the MP3 to our Omni Studio format, which we have. So in terms of producing podcasts, it's not something I've done really much of, although we did do a little bit of production when I had a rather large outtake on a man who jumped off the Newport Bridge and survived.
I remember that, yeah.
Yeah, Redemption. That was earlier this year.
That's right.
We spent 4 months on that, and part of that time, which is a lot of time to spend, but it was well worth it. Some of that time was in podcasting, and Whitman Little, who does do podcast production for us, and I sat with Mark Gonsalves and other people in our podcast studio and did more professional production. And really, when I say we, it was Whitman who did the production on that. And Whitman and I have done other things too. But for the most part, my podcasting is just taking an MP3 and uploading it to Omni Studio.
Right.
But they're very popular, I will tell you that, Oh,
I'm sure they are. I think that there's a lot of validity to that. I've seen a Lively Experiment. Now they podcast that.
Yeah.
And I watch that every week now. Sometimes, though, I find myself listening to it. It's like, well, why not put it on here? You basically know who these people are anyway, their faces, and you can kind of get into the same space while doing another activity, driving or whatever it is.
But when you get to the level of a Mark Smerling, you're really dealing with all the storytelling tools of radio theater from the 1930s and 40s before TV became what it was today. There was really no commercial TV until the late 40s, so before we even had TV. And that includes, sound effects, that includes narration, it includes scripting, the work that he and his partner at Gimlet Media at that time put into the Crime Town podcast. It was a tremendous investment of time and effort down in Brooklyn where they were producing that. So, and also a lot of field work in terms of interviewing people, and so tremendously time consuming. I mean, really parallel, you could almost say to a feature movie in some senses. I mean, not quite the same amount of money and talent involved, but the same commitment and investment of storytelling resources. And the result, of course, was fantastic.
Changed everything as far as what we, at least for me, and what you can do with a podcast and how it can become an evergreen piece, just like a film is in a lot of ways. It's
Absolutely.
Not just a news talk station uploading its day's content.
No, it's its own creation. It's its own story. It's its own production. I like podcasting.
Yeah, it's fun.
And here we are doing a podcast. Here we go.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there's going to be an expansion, and there already is an expansion in podcasting in Rhode Island over the last year or so. I've even seen some other personalities in the market, on the radio in particular, rebrand their on-demand audio as my podcast now all of a sudden. So it's interesting to see how that's become a buzzword.
It's a national growth industry, too. I'm sure you read where Spotify bought Gimlet.
Oh, yeah.
For... I forget the amount of money. It was a huge amount of money.
260 million.
Yeah, it was a lot of money. And Spotify is a large company, very well run. I'm a big Spotify fan myself. For them to invest that kind of money in a major podcasting studio, and Gimlet, of course, is one of the best, tells you really a lot of what you need to know in terms of where this storytelling format is and is going. And I know a lot of the studios and the folks out in Hollywood are very much into podcasting too, both as another way to tell a story and another revenue stream, because that's what Hollywood is about.
I hardly watch any television at all. My wife likes Netflix, Hulu, and that's kind of how she unwinds while I'm doing something else.
We do too. But go ahead.
She pulled me in to watch Chernobyl here, this 4 or 5 part miniseries. We're kind of watching this, and lo and behold, they announce, well, we have a podcast that's concurrent with the miniseries. So there's insight and analysis both on the specifics of the event itself from a world history standpoint, but then also from an acting and production standpoint. So parallel to watching this event or part of this miniseries be released, I think it's every Thursday they put out a new episode. Then the podcast comes out on Friday. It just keeps you engaged in a whole new way, thinking about this series. And for me, it's great because television doesn't capture me, but now I feel really embedded in this project. Yeah. I wonder how much of that, using podcasting as a parallel, piece.
Well, I think from a storytelling point of view, it makes sense, but also from a business and financial point of view, it makes sense. I've been long fascinated by sort of the economics of Hollywood and entertainment in general. And so, the studios and the producers are looking for new revenue streams, and it makes all kinds of sense. So I think that's part of what is driving the podcast phenomenon. If I guess we can't even use that word anymore since it's so well established at this point, it's driving podcasting, at least at that, sort of A-list national, international level. You'd be crazy if you were an executive with a large or even small studio or network or channel not to consider it. I don't know what Disney does in terms of podcasting, but I'm guessing they must have a significant podcast presence as well.
Yeah, you would think that. I think I saw Gimlet. I don't know that that's a youth or children's podcast, but I was on iTunes or Apple Podcasts a couple of days ago and saw they had an ad for what looked like 2 animated characters in a new podcast by Gimlet. And I thought, all right, they're getting into the children's industry, and that's it. That's a whole nother storytelling apparatus for kids podcasting.
Yeah. I know my screen agent, Michael Previtt from Rain Management, my longtime agent out there, he and Rain Management are looking significantly at podcasting, too, as a way of broadening what they do. I mean, they're primarily, or were initially primarily screen, both the big screen and the small screen, also some literary works, but now podcasting, again, is coming into their mix. So really, the world is shifting, but with technology, it always does. Again, I find it just so ironic that podcasting has roots in a very old technology, radio, comparatively old,
right? Which a lot of people dismiss, and then I've heard someone suggest to me that talk radio that actually just podcast themselves may end up on the strong 92.3, 94.1 type signals before we know it. Music will disappear from the airwaves, but might just be podcasting all day on the big stations, kind of going back full circle to the days of the shadow, and all those, you say, the 30 shows right there. Yeah. So fascinating stuff.
Yeah, good stuff.
Let's talk about the story in the public square. Where did that begin, and how did you get to the point where it's one of the flagship programs of WSBE?
Rhode Island Public.
Yeah, Rhode Island Public
Rhode
Television.
Island PBS, rather. Well, that began 7+ years ago when Jim Ludis, who is the head of the Pell Center, and I got together. We've told the story many, many times, so audience, forgive me if you've heard this story before, but many of you may not have. He had hosted, just having come on board the Pell Center, the launch of my biography of Claiborne Pell, An Uncommon Man, the fall before this coffee 7 years ago. And, we'd hit it off. We had a great launch event. Noella Pell, who is the widow of Claiborne Pell, was still alive. She came. Anyway, it was a great day. We hit it off, and we got together for coffee thinking maybe there's something more we can do than just host a book launch party. And Jim comes from the academic and political worlds. I come from the storytelling worlds. And we realized that we could probably put those two interests and skills and strengths together to create something. So we created the Story in the Public Square program at the Pell Center. It was a partnership with the Journal from the start. We had a number of events down at Salve Regina University. We put on a story day for 2 or 3 years and had some great guests. But we got 400 people. We sold out pretty much every year. But we got 300 or 400 people to come down for this story day, and we spent a lot of money. And after the day was over, there it was. So we got the idea that maybe we could do with our resources, our financial resources, something a little different. Maybe we could do TV. And now Jim and I knew very little about TV, certainly not anything about commercial or non-commercial TV at that level. We did a program which we built a set. We brought in a crew down at the Pell Center, and we had Lisa Genova, the best-selling author of Still Alice and a lot of other books, a great, great writer in person. We taped her, and we taped Dan Barry, who used to work at the Providence Journal, now at the New York Times, another best-selling author and great guy, too. We taped them on this set, and the production values were so horrible. They were just so horrible. I can't even tell you how. Yeah. You can probably sense how horrible they were. They were horrible. Yeah. We could not air or do anything with those two programs. But that was a real it was, Jim calls it our training wheels. It was a real learning experience. one thing we learned was you can't do TV in a lobby of the Pell Center with, leaf blowers and crap like that outside, because like that ambient sound isn't really very good. And if you really want to do this in a serious way, you need to get with people who know how to do this seriously. So we went to Rhode Island PBS and a show they produced there still called White House Chronicle, hosted by Llewellyn King, great journalist, still a great show. Llewellyn gave us an opportunity for, I think, 8 occasions, 8 times in a year, so once every month for 8 months, to do an episode of our own Story in the Public Square using his people and his set. And we did that. And that worked out pretty well. And we liked that. Jim and I liked that. Llewellyn liked that. So Jim and I said, well, okay, why don't we see if we can do this on a weekly basis? Why don't we design and build our own set, which we did. We went to Rhode Island PBS, obviously, with whom we were beginning to have a relationship. I actually had a relationship with a former program director from Catherine Larson. She now runs content at Buffalo PBS. Anyway, so we had a relationship. They said, sure, that sounds like a great idea. Let's see what we can do. So we launched the weekly Story in the Public Square program in January of 2017. It was seen only in this market, meaning the southern New England market, Rhode Island PBS. We also negotiated a deal with Sirius XM Satellite Radio to carry the show on their channel 124, the POTUS channel, Politics of the United States, not the President of the United States. So that went really well. We got some really good guests between the people I knew and the people Jim knew, people like Mark Smerling, who agreed to come on at the beginning. So we began to get a reputation. We attracted really good guests, and guests have really made the show, the quality of our guests. Long story short, after doing that for a year or so, Jim and I thought, well, okay, we're succeeding here in this market. Why don't we shoot for national? And there's a very long story there, and I won't bore you with the details, parts of which are really boring, most of which are really boring. But you have to really essentially audition to have a local PBS show be carried nationally. And there's a whole syndicated apparatus involved there. We went through that process. It took months and months and months, and we finally were accepted. And so in September of 2018, just coming up on a year ago, we went into national distribution. And since then, we've grown. We're now seen on over 200 stations, coast to coast. We're in most of the major markets. And we're just having a heck of a time. And again, the guests have made this program, along with our crew at Rhode Island PBS. We have a great bunch of guests. There are all kinds of storytellers from whatever storytelling format you can think of, podcasts, and we've talked about that. We get still photographers, we get filmmakers, we get poets, we get authors, we get journalists, we get academics, scholars, and people who are storytellers whose stories in one way or another intersect with the public discourse. In other words, they have some impact in terms of public policy, social justice, and issues that concern, people, yes. Not simply artists and storytellers, but, the citizens, the residents at large. So we're starting National Season 3 in July. We're rolling out. Lisa Genova kindly agreed to come back after that horrible debacle.
Nice.
So we taped her a few weeks ago. She'll be our leadoff hitter. Great show with Lisa. Again, a fabulous storyteller, Harvard-educated neurosurgeon who had this also rare talent for telling stories. We're going to be taping, actually, coming up in just a few days, Danny Strong, one of the co-creators of Empire himself, a great storyteller, a screenwriter, producer, actor. He was on the Gilmore Girls. Love the Gilmore Girls. So he is coming on the show, and a good, really solid, great lineup of people coming up. I want to mention one other person, and I can mention many, but Phil Deloria, who is the first tenured professor of Native American history at Harvard, and a Native American himself, a very distinguished man with a very interesting background. He is also one of our guests, and he comes on and he talks about, Native American issues, obviously, but storytelling in general. So, fascinating. All coming soon to our local station and stations across the country.
Yeah, and then blasting out from that, the awesome PBS studio. I think a lot of Rhode Islanders don't realize how great the facility is here in Cranston, Rhode Island. And that probably plays at least somewhat of a part in getting the show to the national level as well.
No, it does.
It's not a rinky-dink studio.
Yeah,
frankly.
no, it's hardly rinky-dink.
Yeah.
The studios are on Park Lane in Providence, right near the Cranston line.
Oh, is it in Providence?
It's actually, yes.
Oh, cool.
You could throw a stone and hit Cranston.
It's like where we are right now, essentially.
Yeah, exactly.
Yep.
Yeah. So yeah, great people there. We have a great crew, but it's professional. I mean, at the highest level. With really great equipment, and we are totally pleased to work with these people. It's the level that you get at WGBH, which of course is probably known as the most prominent
king and queen of PBS. Really.
Yeah. No, this is great.
Yeah,
and we tape there generally every other Tuesdays. We occasionally will deviate from that if we have guests in town who can't be there on a Tuesday. And, we look forward to it. It's a lot of work on the part of Jim and myself in terms of, finding people, pre-interviewing, scripting. We don't really script, but we do a lot of preparation we have to read books from people who are authors and so forth. But I find it enormously satisfying. And again, who knew? 7 years ago, I had no clue I was going to be going here. But it goes back to what we were talking about earlier, taking risks and trying new things. And, I think that's always important to try, even if you try new things within your particular genre or format or profession or whatever you're doing. It doesn't mean you have to, climb Mount Everest. I don't recommend climbing Mount Everest, especially after what we've seen recently. Yeah. But anyway, you get my point.
Absolutely. What about social media? How does that factor in at all for your work? Is that something do you present anything on Instagram or
I
YouTube?
have an Instagram account, but I don't use it much professionally. I tend to put photographs of food, flowers.
Surprise.
I know, big surprise. Right? And our new puppy.
Yeah.
So there are only so many hours in a day. So, with everything I do, in addition to all of what I've described, I'm working on more books and so forth and so on. So only so many hours in the day. I devote my social media efforts to Facebook and to Twitter through different accounts. A lot of that is through the Providence Journal's Facebook and Twitter accounts, to which I have access and can use, and also my personal Twitter and Facebook accounts, and also Story in the Public Square down at Salve Regina and the Pell Center. So I use all of these, and I will say, as a creative person, as a writer and storyteller, that it's a two-edged sword. You have to do this in today's world to get attention and draw attention to your work, which you should do and you need to do. But it can be a distraction.
Oh man, it can be. Yeah.
Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. It can be a real time suck.
Yep.
And I've not really found sort of the sweet spot on that. I'm tempted constantly to do something on social media when I know I should be revising a passage in a book I'm writing.
Right. I totally agree. It's a total double-edged sword. Sometimes I feel like Instagram is the missing link between an audience, a potential audience member, and coming on board, whether it's on the podcast side or something I've written or even with music. That conversion is very real and rapid. But at the same time, sometimes I feel like it's just a sort of entertainment for myself to get a dopamine hit when that person hits the heart.
Yeah.
And then you see them, subscribe on somewhere else. I mean, that's real. Is that really what it is at the end of the day? And it's not that you're really expanding the audience when you do that.
No. It's, you get a little rush. Oh, I've got another follower or 10 followers. And then you go on, who unfollowed me on Twitter? And it's like, okay, you unfollow. It gets into this very strange psychology, which I don't like, but there's I wouldn't say an addictive quality, a semi-addictive quality to it. And again, if you're dealing with media as we are, you have to have a presence, particularly with younger people. If you don't, you're shouting down a well. Now that may be good, bad, or indifferent, but that is the reality. Yeah. And I'll let me tell you one more story. In relation to this, years ago, when I began publishing books, I had an editor at Random House by the name of John Karp. He actually worked at the Journal, went off, became a junior editorial assistant at Random House. The first book he ever bought was my first nonfiction book, so we began a relationship. He has since gone on to become the publisher of Simon & Schuster, which is a good connection and friendship to still have, I would add. And he's a great guy. But he, early on, knowing that writers are reticent about, saying a lot about themselves or, doing any of that, and this is, again, before the social media era, he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but I'm capturing the essence of this. He said, Wayne, if you're going to compete in this arena, you're going to have to sell yourself. Paraphrase, but there's the essence of it. And he was right. So he basically beat it into me that you have to sell yourself. And so, I went to media training and with, John's stewardship, as it were, I learned that you do have to sell yourself. I had a website in 1996 before many people, that was in the dial-up era. And that was because of John Karp, and that was actually to sell one of my books. So I've been, again, early on that, but it took a lot of kicking and screaming before I got there, because writers in general are not, that has probably changed now. It has changed now. But back in the 80s and early 90s, early to mid 90s, that's not what writers did. They wrote and then shut up.
Yeah, introverts and you want that attention, but then at the same time you almost want to have the hood up over your head and watch it from afar, in a sense. In balancing all of the work, the different work you do, different income streams, different editors, different people along the way in the creative process, how do you center yourself and really make decisions that, knowing that you have a lot of different people to answer to?
That's a very good question. Personal life centers me, in terms of being grounded and in terms of what matters most. There's no question about that. Professionally, my writing still does. It's still the actual pen to paper or keyboard to screen. That really is what centers me.
And speaking to Wayne's writing, he's got a new book coming out this September, Kid Number 1, a story of heart, soul, and business, featuring Alan Hassenfeld and Hasbro. And I went ahead and put a link to the book's website in the description of this pod. And that's all the time we have for today, but I'll be back on Tuesday with a brand new episode. Until then, I'm Bill Bartholomew. We'll talk soon.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.